If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Psalm 78. The 78th Psalm. This is where we'll be spending our time.
I'm getting stuck.
I hope you can rectify that situation. You know, if you look back over the history of the Jews, there's one thing that sticks out, at least it does to me, and that's the fact of it's a continuous cycle of crest and trough. They crest when they're close to God. God delivers them from something and they're following Him. Like you look at the revival that took place in Israel under Hezekiah, under different kings that came and went who were faithful, and you see this incredible crest. And then in the years following the crest, or even in the book of Judges, the same thing. They slide away from that crest because it's easy once one is contented, fed, watered, taken care of, and no worries, no threat from outside, to become complacent and to just rest in that and forget that because we live in a fallen universe, we have to be intentional about our relationship to God. And this endless crest and trough that you see, it's not there for no reason. It's there to teach us as well. So let's take a look at this text in Psalm 78. I'll begin reading in verse 23. God gave a command to the clouds above and opened the doors in the sky, and He rained manna down for them to eat in the wilderness. He gave them the grain of heaven. Human beings ate the food of the mighty ones, and God sent them more than enough to eat. He brought the east wind through the sky, and by His strength He led forth the south wind. He rained down meat on them like dust, birds as numerous as the sand on the seashores, and He caused the birds to fall right in the middle of their camp and around their homes. And they ate until they were full. He gave them what they desired, and yet they weren't filled up. Their food was still in their mouths when the anger of God flared against them. He killed some of the strongest of the Israelites. He brought some of the young men of Israel to their knees. And despite all of this, they continued to sin. They didn't trust Him to do the amazing things. So He caused them to die unsatisfied and filled with terror. When He struck them down, they sought His favor, and then they turned back and then longed again for God. Now this cycle, if you read just that, if that's all we had to go by, we would say, well, there it is. There's the cycle in human nature. And it speaks to us here, of course, of the Exodus. We're going back to the Exodus in the wilderness. They left Egypt after the plagues. They saw God do all these amazing things. They came to the edge of the Red Sea, and then they feared. And they said to Moses, why did you bring us here just to die? Pharaoh's coming after us. We can see the dust of the chariots and the horses. We know they're pursuing us. And of course, Moses then goes to God and cries out for them. Why did you bring us here? Moses is given a really curious answer here in my mind. God says, why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to just move on. Now, I look at that and I say, this is God saying, what do I have to do before you realize I'm going to take care of you? That's what He's saying. What do I have to do? And Moses has got a greater responsibility than all of the Jews, because Moses is the one who God speaks through and to. And he's the one who's talking face to face with God as though he's speaking to a friend. So God is going to expect of Moses what He doesn't expect of everybody else. Moses is rising to a higher expectation here. I look at Moses and I say to myself, self, I don't want to be Moses. I don't want to be a Moses in any situation. But there's something in human nature here. We are bent toward a certain way of thinking all the time. Now, I thought about it while you and I were talking, Nancy, in Sunday school this morning. And we were talking about what a great thing it is to think about these various times in our lives where God gives us that insight in a moment, where we suddenly awaken to something wonderful about what it is to have a relationship with God. And for just a few seconds, we can just feel it. It's like it's so real. But we can't hold on to it. It's part of the reason why we gather here is for those moments, right? I do. I can't speak for anybody else. But we're unable to hold on to it and to straighten out our way of thinking. And so pretty soon, just like the Jews wandering in the wilderness, we can't trust God's care. We're just not able. We're untrusting because there are things that come into life. They frighten us, they threaten us, they're concrete, they're real. I think about it for Becky and myself driving over here this morning talking about health insurance. And those things stir up in us. They do in me. Maybe you're not like that. Maybe you just float through life totally confident in all of God's care. I do not. I wish I did. But there are reasons, I think, why we become focused on these concrete things that are right in front of us that can hurt us potentially or change our lives in ways we don't want them changed. The first one is this, and let's just be honest with each other and within ourselves. God appears to hide from us. Now, I just think that's true. I can't tell you how many conversations with unbelievers I have. And what's one of the primary questions they have is, why does God hide from me? If He wants me to know Him, why doesn't He make Himself known in a way that I could know Him? Right? I think that's a legitimate question. Let me read for you here something from, and I don't want to make too much of this because it's just a human being, but I think it's important. C.S. Lewis. He was a bachelor his whole life until he was in his 50s. And then he met a woman by the name of Joy Davidman. She had come over to England because her husband was abusing her and her 2 boys. She was a scholar. Lewis said she was at least his equal in intellect, which is pretty prodigious. She came over to England and they became friends because she had read Lewis's writings in the States and wanted to come to England for reasons I don't really understand altogether, but she met him. They became friends and they worked out a deal wherein she was divorcing her husband because he was abusing her and her children physically, and she worked out a deal wherein Lewis and she would go before a magistrate and have a marriage just so she could be in England forever, that she wouldn't have to go back, she wouldn't be deported, she could be a resident of England by marriage, it's kind of like in our country. If you marry into our country a citizen, you become a citizen. Well, of course, after they did this, they became closer and closer and closer until finally they fell in love. And she had cancer, bone cancer, and he knew it. And one day he called her on the telephone and she fell because her leg broke on her way to answering the telephone, and it was Lewis on the phone. Lewis sent the authorities over there and found her in the floor. She couldn't get up, obviously, because her leg was broken. They took her in the hospital. They treated her. And while she was in the hospital, they had a priest from the Anglican Church come in and marry them in the hospital. They were in love. They loved each other with an intensity that few of us ever experienced except for the first few weeks of marriage. I mean, they just absolutely were devotedly in love with one another. Well, she recovered. The doctor said she wasn't going to walk ever again. She recovered. And so her cancer went into remission, her leg healed, and they had 3 years that Lewis looked back upon and just said they were the 3 years in which he really lived. Well, the cancer came back. And Joy Davidman very quickly succumbed to it and died. And Lewis wrote a little book. It was not ever intended to be published. It was called A Grief Observed, and it was a little book where he recorded his feelings as a Christian who obviously, just like you and I would have, was praying for his wife to recover. She left. She died. And he wrote his feelings down in this little book. And I would encourage anybody to read that book. It's short. You can read it in an hour and a half. And he records this, and this is what he says in one of the early chapters. He says, God is easily found in the good times to be present. But go to God when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain. And what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and the sound of bolting and double bolting on the back side of the door, and after that, silence. You may as well turn away. Now, is that really the case? I got to tell you, experientially, in the immediacy of prayer, it is lots of times the case. But is what we perceive to be going on what's really going on? That's the question. Think about it like this. If you go to the dentist, I don't know what it's like for you. I hate the dentist. I do. I just hate it. I hate it. I don't care. Look, you go there and what do? They take metal objects with sharp points on them and scrape on your teeth. Now, it hurts. But that's what you're volunteering for that. And so I know that when I get there, I can't help it. If I clasp my hands together, I know my knuckles are white from all the blood being squeezed out. Or I'm holding onto the arms of the chair and I grip tighter and tighter and tighter. Doesn't do a bit of good. Scraping just goes on. They just keep going. Needles come, drills come, doesn't make any difference. It's kind of like that in life. We come to God, we want to grip hold of Him in these moments, and yet, as Lewis says, a lot of times we come and there's nothing but silence, and we hear the bolting of the doors, and as Lewis says, we might as well walk away. What's going on? It's the physical world lying to us. It lies to us. It's telling us that God doesn't care. It's telling us that God's not listening. It's telling us all these things. Those things are not the truth. The reality is the door's not being bolted, and it's not something wherein we should just walk away, because God does care. The physical reality is just going to beat and beat and beat until we find ourselves despondent and thinking that God doesn't care. That's what's going to happen. That's the way life is. That's why Lewis wrote what he wrote. What's another fear that takes away from us our ability to trust God? Well, the fear that we're not living up to our end of the bargain. The fear that we're not waiting on God properly. I got this picture at home, Isaiah chapter 40, that you guys gave me when I first came here. Big picture. We'll mount up with the wings of eagles. I like that. I mean, that's inspiring. It feels good to think about it. That's awesome. I hope that's exactly what happens every time. But I notice it doesn't. And so the first thing I think is, I'm not waiting on God properly. I don't feel myself mounting up with eagle's wings. I don't feel myself running and not growing weary. I don't feel myself walking and not growing faint. All those things happen. What's going on? The concrete reality is deceiving me. It is telling me that these things are not so. Those little conversations like we had today, those are the places that are true. That's the truth. But the concrete reality is just going to slap me silly and make me think that I can't trust. Just like the Jews. They go into the desert. What are we going to drink, Moses? There's no water here. Did you bring us out here to starve us to death and to kill us with thirst? It's hard to trust when you're in the desert like that. It's hard. Third reason. What we're asking for, our desires, they're not upright enough for God to pay attention and to grant. He's not going to give us that stuff because it's not the right stuff to ask for. Now, could be we're onto something here. I mean, this could be that we're asking for wrong things. But let me ask you a question. How much of that do you really know? I don't know. I ask God for everything. I don't care what it is. God, I lost my pen. Help me find I'm leaving the house and I realize I've laid my wallet down. I can't find it. Can you help me find my wallet? Now, does God, with starving people and nations at war, think very much about my wallet? I don't know. But you know what? If I can't ask God safely, then how can I trust Him? But I can ask Him safely. I have a friend who thinks about this so strongly that he said to me, and he's a believer right here in this church, he said to me, I never ever ask God for anything for myself. I thought, wow. I mean, I don't have a clue. I'll just say it straight out. I'm standing right here now, I'm doing this sermon, but I don't have a clue what God's will is for my life. I do not. I know the biblical will. I know what the Bible says I'm supposed to do and be, but when it comes to something about what I'm supposed to do and be each day or each minute of each day, I don't have a clue. But I'm going to ask Him anyhow. And I'm not going to be stopped in asking Him. Because where else am I going to go? Who else am I going to ask? I've traveled that road. I don't know about any of you. But, you know, we get into the spot where we're thinking about something very serious in our life as a Christian. What do? We go seek out people we think who will know. We ask about a dozen of them, and then we realize we're not going to find what we're looking for. The only place we're going to find it is God Himself. That's the only place we're going to find it. So I'm just going to ask anyhow, even if I'm wrong. The fourth one, maybe we think our surrender to God isn't complete enough. And so God's not going to answer us. Could be onto something there too. Could be. Could be that we're not surrendered. Let me ask you a question. Let's take our Bible, our New Testament, and if you ever use a concordance, you know what a concordance is? It's a place where you look up a word, surrender, and you go through and you find all the verses that are connected to it, and if you've got a really good one, it'll find verses for you that are connected to surrender in a sideways kind of way. Doesn't use that word, but it talks about the concept, and you'll find verses, just loads of them. And then take that concordance and take every one of those verses and read them all one at a time. And let me just ask you then, once you're done with all this process, and go find some books at the Christian bookstore that are titled Surrender to God, Surrender Your Will, all of that kind of language. Read those. When you get done with all that, will you have learned how to surrender? No, you won't. Because you can't teach it. Surrender can only be caught, not taught. C.S. Lewis said this. Listen to this, and this is in A Grief Observed. He comments further, later chapter. He says, God has not been trying out an experiment on my faith or my love for Him in order to find out the quality of it. He already knows that, right? That's true. But it was I who didn't know. He always knew that my temple, me, was a house of cards. And His only way of making me realize that fact was to knock it down. Now think about that for a minute. You and I are placed in the dock. You know what the dock is? It's the witness stand. We're placed in it. We sit there, but we also sit in the judgment seat over our own lives in the same way. So we're not only the witness, we're the judge. We're looking at our lives and saying all these things are wrong with us. This is why God doesn't answer us. It's like we're occupying the teacher's podium and the student's desk at the same time. So here we are, and we look at the history of the Jews and their crests and troughs, and we think about that, and we think, well, what am I supposed to learn there? I'll tell you what we should learn. We're not going to find surrender in a book. It's only going to be caught, not taught. That's the only way we'll get it. These things that hold us back from God, we cannot unlearn them. We can't unlearn them. We can't learn how to be more surrendered. We can't learn how to ask for right things. We can't learn any of that. The only way it happens is we catch it. So if Jesus came in here, and I believe He is in here, but if He came in here physically and looked down at all of us, can you imagine? If He comes in here like that, I'm going to sit down. I'm not going to stay up here. I'll go sit and listen to Him. And if He looks out at us and says, do you want to be strong in the Lord? I guarantee you all of us are going to say, yeah, I want that. At least while we're in here. I mean, once we get out there, maybe we rethink it and we think, well, I don't know if I'm really all that interested in being strong in the Lord. But while we're in here, everybody's going to say that, right? If there were 1,000 people here, everybody would say, oh yes, I want to be strong in the Lord, especially if Jesus took the podium. But you know, there's a price to be paid for that. Some of us will make voluntary choices that put us in positions to grow in the Lord. But others of us, and this is most of us most of the time, are not going to find those places. We're going to have to be taken there. We're going to have to be taken to those places. Let me give you an example. Pray to God for courage. That sounds good, doesn't it? Let's ask God for courage. Everybody bow their heads. We pray for God to give us courage. But we're not going to get courage like that. You know how we're going to get it? He's going to stick us in a place where we need it. Pray for patience. Ever heard that? I've heard that all my life. Don't pray for patience. Why? Because God will put you in a spot where you got to have it. If you want to survive where you are. Pray for better family relations. There's a good one. Ooh, pray that we'll be better in our family relationships. You're not going to get warm, fuzzy feelings about our families. No, God's going to stick us in a spot where we have to get better at it. Think about it from the standpoint of Elijah. This always struck me. Think about Elijah, what he did. He went and built an altar, covered it with water, challenged the 450 prophets of Baal. They built an altar too. And they danced for 3/4 of a day and cut themselves and cried out to Baal to sweep up and destroy the altar. Nothing happened until they just exhausted themselves. Well, Elijah, he built an altar and covered it with water to the point that the moat around the altar was filled with water. So wet. And then he just said, God, hear me. And the altar was consumed with fire. Just like that. And then what did Elijah do? He went and hid in a cave because he was afraid of Jezebel and the prophets and Ahab. I mean, that's what we're like. Can you imagine? You would say, I would say, oh, if God would do something like that in front of me, I would never doubt. You better go back and read about Elijah. He killed all the 450 prophets. And the altar was consumed with just a simple word, God, hear me. And yet, he went and hid in a cave and prayed that God would kill him. He was despairing of his life. I'll tell you, this is the way it is. God is going to, throughout our lives, He's going to bring us to places and people and times and circumstances where we have to grow. And that's just the way it is. But you know what? It's good. And it's for our best. It's not so that God can, like a kid with an aquarium with a lizard in it, that he can pull the wings off flies and then throw them in there for the lizard to chase around. It's not like that at all. God is doing it. He doesn't have to do any of this. He does it for us because He's a giver. And He does it for our best, not His. I don't know where everybody is today. If I said anything about which you got a prayer request or something you'd like to speak with me about, I'll stay